Hello, and welcome to a Bon Mott's production of
MOTSterpiece Theatre,
where we review critically acclaimed cinema spanning the breadth of human filmmaking.
MOTSterpiece Theatre.
Spoilers, mature content, inappropriate language. Join us.
MOTSterpiece Theatre.
Hi, and welcome back to MOTSterpiece Theatre. Tonight we are reviewing the number 4 on the AFI Top 100 list, Ragin' Bull. My name is Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Stephen Hermosi.
Hello.
And Scott Thurlow.
And I am an animal.
So I will give the funny logline today, Italian stereotypes of the movie. Anyway, Steve-O, on to you for the actual synopsis of the film.
All right, so this is a film about a boxer, Jake LaMotta, who has a pretty long and storied career, rises up through the ranks to eventually become the champ, which doesn't fulfill him, obviously, because it's, Scorsese and it's all very sad. And then
That's what we're into.
And then he becomes a comedian, and then goes to jail, and then is still a comedian afterwards. And that's it.
And ends on a pathetic note of his life.
Yes.
Yes.
So I'll start off with the introduction, and I'll be pretty concise with this. It takes place kind of early/mid-career of... you get the sense that he's a pretty established fighter. At this point, he grows up in the Bronx with his manager/brother, Joe Pesci, whose character's name is Joey.
Played by Joe Pesci.
Yeah. Now, you see him get into some fights, and you're following his boxing career, which it's actually not. Although it's a boxing film, there's not a lot of boxing happening on screen.
There's some spare actual boxing footage, but other than that, yeah.
He meets his future wife and pursues her, and I think that, and it's super Italian.
Yes.
Yeah, people get into screaming matches constantly. There's a brawl at a church
Nightclub.
dinner thing.
That too, yeah.
It's very, very cliched and of the Italian American experience.
It's very much set up that he is not too bright guy who is great at fighting and has a little bit of charm and swagger to him. He's married at the beginning, by the way, and him and his wife do nothing but fight, and he kind of it's really weird. So after he meets his future wife, which you'll find out about later in the film, I think Ian, you said, wait, where's his wife in all this? And Scott was like, oh yeah, she's gone. And so Ian and I have not seen the film yet, and Scott has seen it before, and Scott's like, yeah, she's gone. And we were like, oh wait, what? And he was like, yeah, there's a little throwaway line where it's like, I'm leaving or whatever, while they're having an
She ships
argument
herself on a
out,
bus,
yeah,
pretty much.
while they're having an argument out the window of the apartment. But
Sure.
it was to me, it was an underwhelming introduction. I think that the rest of the movie is better, but that intro was a little bit confusing. A lot of yelling in Italian accents, in New York Italian accents.
And then they would also whisper a lot of the lines, which made it difficult to hear those throwaway lines that happen to be pertinent to the plot. I agree. It was underwhelming, and I knew what this movie was about, but I didn't know stylistically how it would play out. So I was surprised to the movie's detriment on the tone that it established from the beginning. And it initially didn't sell me on what the movie would be. It took a little while for me to build up to actually buying into the ride.
Interesting. Yeah, sure. Like you said, so to be clear, this is the 4th time, I believe, I've seen this movie all the way through. And you guys have not seen it before, previous to this. So I guess we're going to with different eyes and different mindsets, just because of that fact. So that's fine. Like, it's difficult because I see why you guys would say it's underwhelming. You might almost have convinced me upon this watching, but I think I might give it a soft 1, but still a 1 nevertheless. Because I think it is engaging enough. It sets up the character. It sets up, like, you're introduced to his world and, like, what his life is like. This is Jake LaMotta's life. So my funny line was going to be, it's a Jake LaMotta. Like, yeah, which goes into, like I said, yes. They play off of many Italian-American stereotypes. And perhaps it doesn't always work throughout. But nevertheless, I still think it was engaging enough, even though I have a history with this movie. So I'll probably give it a soft 1 for the introduction. But perhaps without your guys' observations, I might have given it a more solid 1.
Yeah. I don't think it was a terrible opening by any means. It was just not what I was expecting. And
okay,
considering this is number 4 on the list of like the best movies of all time, it was, again, disappointing. So I'm going to give it a soft 0 because it wasn't bad.
Perhaps
it
the
just
hype
wasn't
outweighed it. All right.
Yes.
That's fair.
I would agree with you. I think we're going, Ian. I think you and I are going to differ on a several points in this film, but this is one where I think we can agree.
You agree upon,
and I just it wasn't what I expected from a movie that's, critically acclaimed as one of the best movies of all time. It wasn't terrible, but it didn't grab me right away.
And I have to assess this as one of the best movies, on a scale of one of the best movies of all time. I can't give it the benefit of the doubt that
just because,
a person that would be, or a movie that would be ranked less, I would give. So
that's fair enough. And just quickly, my final ending for this is that I knew it was in the top 10. I thought it was number 6, not number 4. Maybe that's a minimal difference, but still, regardless, keeping that in mind, we'll go on. All right,
Steve-O, onto the body with you.
All right, so the body, I think we agreed, begins with the montage of his. It's a montage of a bunch of years of his fights and his marriage to Vicky.
Fights in family life, we'll say.
Right. And then more fights, and then his brother Joey's marriage to his wife. And then more fights. And then it comes back in to kind of him in married life and making his way through that. And, he's got a couple kids at this point, I believe. And,
I think 3 kids, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a lot of like interspersed throughout the body. I'm not going to touch on every single point, but like throughout the body, it's a lot of interspersed like his moments of his life in between the big fights that are coming up, and a lot of it is balanced upon where he is in his career. So like there's points of tension where he's like, there's a point where he's like asked to throw a fight, and that makes his personal life very tense. He's also becomes like weirdly he
increasingly suspicious.
Yeah, he just thinks that his wife is cheating on him all the time, and to the point where he asks his brother Joey to like spy on her for him. It's just a bunch of and Joey ends up beating the hell out of somebody because he thinks that
Vicky,
Jack's wife, is stepping out on him. Yeah, Vicky, Jack's wife. So there's all these like little moments, and none of them by themselves are, I would say, super important, but they kind of bring everything. They kind of show the life that this guy had. And so there's like that moment. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. It all kind of leads up to up throughout his fighting career, and up to the point where he ends up getting a title shot finally. After he's told he has to throw a fight and then he'll get a title shot. Throws the fight. There's some backlash about it because it was really obvious that he threw the fight, and then he does get a title shot and he beats the living hell out of the champion. And then I believe he defends it once successfully, and then he fights the guy that he has fought, I think, 4 times previously.
Actually, this was their 6th time fighting.
Sugar Ray Robinson.
Yeah.
They say it.
And he ends up getting beat pretty soundly. But he does go up to Sugar Ray at the end of the fight and he says, "Hey, you still never knocked me over."
Yep.
So he's got that little character moment in there. And I think that's about the point where the body ends. So it's like it's a lot of these like little and this is a biopic about LaMotta and he, he's a real person and it's about his life. And there's a lot of these little moments that are taken throughout in between his fights that I think are, kind of poignant and trying to show what he was as a person. Not necessarily saying that he was a good person or a bad person, but saying that he was this guy.
Just who he was.
He was a fighter. Sure. He was kind of dumb as a rock, especially in certain ways. And that's who he was. And it showed his life,
I will say, upon retrospect, so it's difficult, but I think I'm convincing myself and also as we talk that yes, all that's contained in there and perhaps it should be interesting. But I think upon this being my fourth viewing, as I said, I don't know if it works as well as I thought it did in my own mind. Upon actually viewing it, the body that is itself, I think it's a bit more meandering, like a bit more like sort of jumping around than it should be. If not jarring, it's just unfocused, I think is the term I want to say here. So yes, while it does show what he was doing, sure, it shows like, it's basically a montage of his fights and so forth, like LaMotta versus whoever, and like 2-second scene of like him punching someone else in the face. And like, yeah, he's working up with the ranks. And then like an actual like dialogue scene for like a minute or two. But I just don't know if it's like holds together as well as I thought it did.
We've watched a couple of biopics recently, and we've had a discussion over how much historical accuracy is actually good for storytelling in a biopic, because they have to introduce certain characters in order, even if they're there for a second and then get shipped on a bus like his former wife. But again, that could leave, because lives are chaotic, and it could leave a movie seeming chaotic. I actually think the body was the best part of the film, because I was starting to buy into his storyline, and I liked the development, because I would say traditionally this type of movie would have the main character fall prey to his fame. And that's not necessarily something that I saw.
Quite what happens.
But it's, in a way, the, like, hyper masculinity of, like, this culture of, like, I need to be super protective of my wife. Because, and like, that kind of metaphor, like, him having to fight, like, that's what his driving factor was. And when it comes to the conclusion, I don't know how effective it was in panning out, but I thought they started to build a decent heroic flaw in this character. And also Joe Pesci Joe Pesci deserves like all of the credit, because he carried a lot of the weight of this film.
We'll talk about him in supporting, I'm sure, but it's just funny because I could have sworn, like, blindly going into this, that you would have been on my side in a certain sense, like giving the body a 0 because of everything I just said, but you said it was the most engaging part to you. I just found it interesting that based on what we said precast, I could have bet that you would have not given the body a good score. And I think I convinced myself that I'm not going to. What do you think, Steve?
So here's what I think of the body. I know that my description of it might have made it seem like it was meandering, but I don't think that it actually was. I go back and I think about it, and there's a pretty solid arc there.
It's a close call.
I think there's a pretty solid arc there. There's the beginning of the body where he and Vicky are newly, in love or whatever, and then they've gotten married, had a couple kids, and they are pretty close. And then you kind of see the destruction of his from one thing that she mentions one time. You see this whole destruction of their entire... She says that one of the guys that he's fighting has a pretty face or something. And you see this, like, the complete mistrust grow and grow out of that. Yeah, exactly. You see that grow and grow out of that. And along with that, you see where his relationship with his brother goes and all of and all of that, like, where he becomes more and more mistrustful of his brother because he thinks that his brother is sleeping with his wife.
Of everyone, yeah.
And I don't know. I like where the body went. I thought that it did a very good job of growing this character arc. Where I don't think there was any real movement in the intro. I think that the body is where his character grows or changes. Not necessarily grows. I think grows is the wrong word, but like where his character changes.
I like your backtrack there.
And you see, you kind of learn what his mindset is.
I don't know. It's weird. I might have convinced myself to give it a 0, even though you guys make very good points. It's weird because having watched it this recent time, I'm not sure if it indeed is as good as I remember it being, and also deserves a spot that it has now on the list. So I might give it a soft 0 reversely, as we just scored it in the intro.
Yeah, I'm giving it a soft 1 because I'm going to confess that I didn't particularly enjoy this movie. And I feel there's a lot of flaws with it, but I'll give credit where credit is due, at least in my view, and give it a soft 1.
All right.
I'm gonna give it a pretty solid one.
Yeah.
I
That's what I marked it down for.
I liked where it went.
All right, and Scott, on to conclusion.
Well, all right. So I guess we may differ on this one. So I think we agreed it's going to be right when he's retired from boxing, essentially, and he's noticeably pudgier, if you will, De Niro, that is. So he's in Florida with his family, with Vicky, with his 3 kids who are like maybe 7, 6, and 4 or something like that. Doesn't matter. His 3 kids, and he's being interviewed, and he's sort of, he's just trying to live his life like outside like of the boxing life that he knew beforehand, which is pretty much all he knew. So he's bought himself a nightclub, named it after himself, obviously, and appears there as a sort of like second-rate, if that, stand-up comedian. But people still know him, and like they recognize him, so they show up. They're like, "Oh, Jake LaMotta's club. Let's go here. We'll hang out and see how he is." And he realizes he's not as great as he thought he was, even at that. Boxing, of course, was his number 1 skill, but he figures, hey, maybe I can get by telling stories about my boxing days and making jokes about him. But even then, it's still like people like, he's got the guy like heckling him from the crowd, like, "Fuck you, LaMotta, you suck." Like, essentially that. So like, it's, how should I describe it? Ian hates it when things become cringeworthy, when like it's embarrassing for the characters on film. He gets embarrassed for them. And I could see, like, while watching this, you were doing something like that.
I left the room at a point.
But I see what you mean. But to me, like, it's kind of the whole point. Like, yeah, it's the decline of this once great, his glory has now faded. Whatever glory he had has long faded, and he's trying to hang on to whatever he can wring out of it. And it's kind of like pathetic and depressing. But that's the kind of thing I like. So like, that's sort of like the 180 here. You guys probably are going to say you don't like it as much, but I do, because that's how life is. That's what would be this guy's ending his long tooth days. That's what would be, his life would be like this. And it is indeed like that.
As much as I pretend to enjoy Schadenfreude, I don't particularly, again, it's just your interpretation on what the character learned throughout this.
Sure.
You forgot the point. When he basically lets 14-year-old girls into his club and goes to jail.
Not basically.
Yes,
he definitely does.
He does.
Definitely
but
does.
He knows that on purpose, but I get what you're saying. Go on.
And goes to jail for that. And like, I never got the sense in this that he ever realized he was anything but the champ. Mm. And there's really? Almost never kind of a waver. That's the sense I got from it. That's my interpretation of it. That he, like, yeah, he'll have moments of, like, especially like in jail when he's punching the walls, he'll have moments of like, where's my life gone? And then he'll be like, get up the next day and be like, all right, I'm going to go fight my next bout. And the character development over the course of this movie, it would be equally as much as if we just watched an hour-long thing of him in the bathroom. Like, I don't know, just a random Sunday morning. Because he doesn't learn, I don't feel, aside from weight, his character doesn't grow at all. And, and like, this is my big, like, this is what kind of infuriated me. Maybe it's the wrong interpretation, but that's what I got out of it. I left watching this movie very angry.
I see what you're saying, and perhaps that probably applies more to themes, which we'll get into shortly. but I think maybe you can't escape it, like, in that sense. So, again, to me, we'll have to agree to disagree upon this one aspect about it, because I think this is the point. Even if his character doesn't grow and change or learn, or maybe he learns like the most minuscule thing about himself, has some sort of like vague reflection upon his life, but it's not the one it should be. But I think it's the one that the movie handles well.
What is the narrative closure of this work?
For his character?
No, like what is the narrative? What is the attempt of this movie? What is the point of this film, and what is the closure?
You can be the best
reached?
you can be at one specific thing, but if you can't like realize the greater aspects of life, then you can't be satisfied. You'll never be satisfied. You'll be trying to relive your own glory days, even if you can't see that you're doing that to recapture some kind of semblance of happiness, I guess I want to say.
All right. Well,
what do you think?
Ian, this is where we're going to break from each other, I think. And Scott, I don't necessarily agree with you either. I do to an extent, but I think that some of the beauty of this movie is in the changing of his character, despite the fact that Jake LaMotta himself doesn't even understand what's going on and can't even comprehend it or grasp it. And he becomes this pathetic human towards the end. And I think I mentioned this before. This movie is not about his growth as a character. It's not about his epiphany and understanding where he went wrong and understanding what he did wrong. It's about the audience and their epiphany about
that,
what he is, and about how somebody that is a douchebag who has his glory days, that is not who that person is. That glory that guy, that Jake LaMotta had in the ring, is not what Jake LaMotta is. And honestly, the complete pathetic human being that he is at the end, even if he can't see it, but you can see it, that complete pathetic human being that he is at the end isn't who he is either. What he is a conglomeration of all of these things, these human moments that have happened throughout the film. And I think that his speech at the end really tied all that together when he's talking about, like, when he says, you know, when he's practicing his act in front of the mirror and psyching himself up, and like, that is the person that he is. Kind of when he's by himself in front of the mirror, that's kind of, he's not trying to impress anybody. He's just psyching himself up to be to be whatever he can
live up to
possibly do, to do whatever he can possibly do to continue his life, to get to the next moment. When he says, I could have been a contender, when he says, that whole end of the movie, I like, the more I'm thinking about it now, like, after having seen it, I really like it more and more, because it's not about him. It's about seeing a life kind of laid bare in front of you, and it's, you know, he doesn't have to have an epiphany. He doesn't have to have closure. He doesn't have to understand what he did wrong. He doesn't have to learn anything. What we're supposed to see as an audience is who that person is. And as you were saying, Ian, I think you looked up a little bit about his life, like the real Jake LaMotta, about his life, and he was in a bunch of movies and stuff like this, which you don't really see in this film. But I think what Scorsese, when he was directing this, was trying to do is just get you to the point where you have seen him at all extremes of his life. You've seen all that he is, and you can judge for yourself what he is at that point.
That was very well said, and you've won me over with that. Although I still, for instance, I'm going to bring up another movie we saw recently, Fences, which I felt did this better with dealing. I still like it in this film, and it's actually, in a sense, a different kind of emotion that's evoked than what we saw in Fences. Which was, like, that one movie was very heavy, intense drama. Sure. This was, in a sense, like, the worst aspect of a person overall that upset me watching that, but I respect if that was the intent going in, I respect that.
No, I mean, I already gave it 1 going into it, but I do like what you said, Steve. Like, it's not necessarily the character who has to learn or have some kind of epiphany. It's what the audience extracts from his experience.
Right.
So, I mean, I'll go to 1 for that as well, on top of what I was already going to give it a 1 for.
So, we're on to themes, but we just did themes.
Yeah, actually, that's kind of true. It's sort of unfolded. Like, the conclusion sort of encapsulates the themes, if you will. And
so, I really do think it's the narrative is wrapped up heavily with what I want to say. There's just one last a small bit I wanted to bring in, which was the use of violence in this film, which, doing some meta research, it was actually very much panned for its display of violence.
Depiction of that.
Yeah.
And
The squirting blood.
yes. And I think there's it's almost a toned down version of like a Quentin Tarantino kind of violence, but like the idea of like the ultra violence, like the accentuation of violence.
Okay.
But it was never done for gore effect. It was done to
be a
the
sense to be
brutality of the
realistic.
ring.
Yeah, sure.
But like it was over the top though.
Yeah.
I think that might go to style, but I mean, I agree in the sense
but no,
that
there's certainly a discussion of violence, and both the idea of how it's comical at times in this. Like there's one scene where Joe Pesci, the brother, is sitting at the dinner table, and Jake goes up to and just basically grabs him from the dinner table.
Yeah.
And I was laughing, but I think that there was an intention of there being a humor in some of the aspects of violence. But then there's the other aspects of violence.
the drama,
where he's like,
sure,
he's abusing his wife. So that was a very interesting, like, I don't know necessarily what he was intending to do with that violence. I think you can actually grasp a lot of different themes from that. But I thought it was very interesting the way he used it.
No, I think I'll tie it into just what you said, Steve, of course, that it's not about the character extracting something from himself in the fictional story or like the adaptation of the real life person. It's about the audience extracting something from his life as portrayed in such.
Sure.
So I'll give it a 1, a pretty solid 1 for themes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give it a 1 for themes as well. Just to touch on the violence a little bit, too. I think that there is, like, there was something that was trying to be said about how violence begets violence and how, it being this violent person in the ring often bleeds over into your personal life, which it certainly did in this movie, which I think, was an interesting theme to touch on. You see it a lot, especially in athletes that, in real life, in athletes that play violent sports. Like you see it in the NFL a lot and boxing as well, MMA, what have you. If you make your living beating the hell out of people in some way,
it's going to affect your life.
That's going to be a normal thing to you, and oftentimes it'll bleed over into your normal. It's tough to separate those two things.
Well, I think that was why Scorsese attempted to use the comical violence in there too, to normalize it amongst the audience.
Right.
Not that he was saying it's a good thing, but just saying that this is how you're approaching violence in this film is how the main character sees violence as well.
I like that. Yeah. I think it's a good point to slide in the end.
So I'm definitely going to give themes a 1.
Yep.
Okay. And we're on to antagonist with Stephen Ramosi.
All right. So the antagonist in this movie, I may perhaps once again make the antagonist the same as the protagonist.
All offenses, yeah. I'm going to agree with that.
Jake LaMotta is his own worst enemy in this
exactly.
movie. He is a quote unquote hero in the ring, but he can't keep his temper in the ring. And that's what causes most of his problems.
Is his undoing
in his life. He gets very, concerned that his wife is cheating on him, and he slaps her around. There's points in the movie where he just slaps her around, and it's, there's this definite take on, domestic abuse, and even Joey, his brother, it gets incredibly violent with somebody in an altercation. So perhaps just like anger or like the not being able to control one's temper could be some sort of antagonist. But I mean that might be a little too ethereal for me.
It's the culture of violence in Italian American homes.
I mean that's actually a fairly decent specific thing. Maybe Scorsese was trying to say something about that, but yeah, I mean, to be honest, if you need to pinpoint it to one thing, I think Jake LaMotta is his own worst enemy in this movie.
No, it's both in the follows, of course. Of course, I agree. Yeah, and I think that's why I think it makes it. Maybe you guys, based on what you said up to this point, don't agree to such an extent, but it makes it an interesting character study piece because, in fact, yeah, if he had just toned himself or taken a step back, he would realize that he's creating most of the problems, if not all, in his own life.
I agree with that, but perhaps if he was able to do that, he would not have been such a good fighter.
Exactly.
You know, like, that's
right.
That's
it's a double-edged sword, of course.
Is he the same person if he's not that angry?
Without that, how does it change?
Person?
I absolutely agree with that. But that means, all I'm saying is that means that I absolutely agree with you guys that he's going to be his own antagonist because of that fact.
Sure.
Because of that aspect of his character.
You know,
at least as portrayed in the film.
Both sides of the coin.
Exactly. So yeah, I think I agree with that. It's a pretty damn solid one for me. Jake LaMotta is, in fact, as you said, Stevo, his own worst enemy.
And I like that as an antagonist. Like he really antagonizes the hell out of himself.
I'm going to save my score for when we discuss the protagonist.
Okay.
So Scott,
all right.
how the protagonist with you?
As we just said, LaMotta, again, he's both. Because it's a character piece and wrapped around like less so of a period piece, but nevertheless, it's 1940s Brooklyn, New York, in the boxing arena. But it's just a study of him, who he is, what makes him tick, what makes him good as a good fighter, good in the ring, and also he carries those traits and aspects into his daily life, which, because of that, I think makes him an interesting protagonist. I think De Niro and Scorsese, like the script, everything came together. I think this is the strongest point of this movie because of the fact that he's both and he portrays both so well. You can see why he's his own worst enemy, but also like why he has flashes of like at least trying to be decent, but he can't help it when he falls to his worst traits, when he falls prey to his own worst, mental hang-ups.
Mm-hmm. See, the thing is, Robert De Niro did a fine, very good job acting in this. The thing is, it's watching a character that I dislike on so many levels. Sure. In fact, I would argue that this character has no redeeming qualities.
You don't have to like him, though. You have to think he's interesting, I would say.
No, I'm interested in his self-destruction. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in his tragedy. I think I'm going to give a 1 to antagonist while giving a 0 to protagonist.
You bastard! I just had a whole
all right
monologue prep for this, but right. Yeah, like
why don't you pull Raging Bull on us right now?
I think he's incredibly interesting when he's destroying his own life, and he's kind of boring when he's not.
When he's not doing that,
like he does have these moments where he's just like kind of calm, or when he's
normal-ish.
That weird-ass love scene in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I knew you were going to bring that up. I knew one of you was going to bring that up.
And that's when he's being a normal person, and I wasn't that into that. I was much more into when he was ruining his own life than all the times that he was actually doing the things that he was supposed to be doing, or like when he was, making something out of himself, which is sad to say. I'm sorry, Jake LaMotta. I wish you had been a better person, I suppose. But since you weren't, you make for an interesting story.
But the themes wouldn't have worked if he made an interesting story. Right.
This would not have been a movie if he wasn't a dick.
And that's what I'm saying. So I get what you guys are saying. I get where you're coming from. I feel you. But I think if you think he's a good antagonist because he's also a protagonist, you have to give him credit on both fronts. While I agree that, yes, it's more interesting when he's basically shipwrecking his own life, because of his own actions. But that means when you're following him as a true, in quotes, true protagonist, you have to give him credit on that front. So I'll give him a softer one as a protag, but nevertheless still a 1 because he's definitely a stronger antagonist, but he's both at once.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I just can't give him the credit for that, so I'm going to give it a 0.
All right. You too, Steve-O?
Yeah, man.
Alright.
I have to give him a 0 for protagonist. So you're giving him a 1 for antagonist, right, Ian?
I know, 0 for protagonist.
Okay.
I'm giving him 1 for both.
Yeah, I'm going...
For the reasons I just said.
I'm going 1 and 0. All right.
Now, the supporting characters with me, and this is getting a 1 strictly on the performance of Joe Pesci.
Joe Pesci.
Who was being Joe Pesci.
Yeah.
Sure.
But
he was being a great Joe Pesci.
but not only that,
a classic Pesci.
He was a vulnerable Pesci.
He was a
and you don't
vulnerable
see a
Pesci.
vulnerable Pesci that often.
Yeah,
You didn't see it much after this movie, but you did see it in this movie.
Like he played a little brother perfectly.
He played second fiddle
Yeah.
and felt sort of resentful. I
Like,
agree with that.
You could tell that he both looked up to and was terrified of his older brother.
And had somewhat of a grudge against him because if he just ran himself in, like he's like, again, like 2 or 3 scenes when they're confronting each other, Pesci's character would say, listen, you're going off the rails. Just take a step back. If only you just took a step back, we could resolve the situation, but you're not going to. And I know that because you're my brother.
There was Vicky also. I think she did a fine job. But
She was okay. She was definitely solid, I guess I'll say.
There's actually a couple. I give this more credit to Martin Scorsese than I do necessarily the actress who played it. But there are some great shots of her giving like looks. Like she'll be at the ringside and they'll just kind of like pan over. Like so she's really good at doing those kind of shots. This is all black and white film, so she has that kind of
Noir style.
classic noir feel to her.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of like mobsters you've seen in other mob movies. But I think in a sense, Joe Pesci and Vicky are the 2 most prominent supporting characters in this work.
Absolutely agree. And I would definitely, like you said, like, I'm just going to second you. Pesci has to get a 1. He just does a phenomenal job playing the, in quotes, Joe Pesci-ish guy you've ever seen, but with more of a rounded out, and especially the vulnerability thing, I think, rings true.
I thought the best scenes in this movie were Pesci and De Niro going back, like having a little like conversations, like a little back and forth.
Sure.
You know, the super duper Italian, like just family discussions. And I mean, Pesci's got to get a 1. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I would go as far as to say this movie wouldn't.
Without him, it would be weaker.
Yeah, much weaker. Anyway, Stephen, onto you for dialogue.
Well, I just mentioned several of the back and forths. I thought the dialogue was strong in this movie. Is it the best dialogue I've ever heard in my life? No. But it was good, and the conversations between Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro, I don't know whether to give this to because they're all very terse, short, but
that's kind of
still well written dialogue. But I think that at least half of the credit has to go to the acting of both these guys.
Oh, absolutely.
It is they pull it off so well.
They're entwined with each other, I would say, yeah, for sure.
And you know, I know they worked together several times after this, but and I think before as well they worked with each other before this as well.
Either way.
But like they're just like their little short, terse conversations are so perfect. And I have to give dialogue full credit. Even if just for that. The other dialogue is good as well, but that's really where the movie shines.
So I know Ian was literally cringing here and there throughout some of it, but not necessarily for the dialogue. You can speak upon it in a second. But I think it was always one of the strongest points of this film. And I think upon this viewing, it still stands. And especially for what you said, Steve-O, those scenes, of course, are the highlight, for sure. But even like everything else surrounding that, I think was perfectly solid and well acted. Believable, I guess, is the word I start to use like more and more nowadays. But I think, and yes, the credit to the acting, all credit in the world, but that means that they're enacting their dialogue incredibly believably, incredibly realistically.
On the Joe Pesci, Robert De Niro dialogue, you guys said it all. Yeah, there were parts that I cringed at. a couple of them were intentional by the screenwriters to make you cringe.
Yeah. Awkward flirting.
No, I was more specifically speaking of
the comedy sets.
When he's this fat, like
washed up,
sure. Old athlete trying to do a comedy set. It was painful to watch, but it was intended to be. So again, I'll forgive it for that. So I have to give it a 1 because the 80%, 85% of the dialogue is perfect in this. So.
Yeah. All right, so strong ones, I think, on dialogue for everybody.
And Scott, onto his style.
All right, so Scorsese film in black and white, and I can go further into that, but I think I'll let, rather than describing it, I'm going to let Steve-O tell a story real quick, but I'll just say that, I mean, it's shot, like you said, there's some noir shots, and it's not necessarily a noir film by any means. It's just that it happens to be like that style sort of falls into it. I think it was all perfect because Scorsese is who he is, and is one of his early breakout stand-up films from 1980 is when it was filmed, was when it was made. So, yeah, I mean, he knows what he's doing. It was almost like, again, a la Fences, which you brought up earlier. It's a play, essentially. Right? At the core of it, it's basically scenes of him and his family and his wife and his brother with some montages of like action fight scenes shown in. Sure. But
funny enough, he did, the actual real life boxer did try to put on a play of his life, and it failed miserably and was considered confusing. And
sure. Well, perhaps I can see that, but I will say that it was streamlined enough, and I'm saying cinematography and everything like is the reason why this is a classic film. For like capital F filmatically wise, and I will give it a lot of credit on that front. I think you have to give it a 1 for style.
There are some beautifully shot scenes in this movie, and I'm just gonna talk about one. And they absolutely nailed the opening scene where he is in a ring. It like in black and white. It almost looks like. Well, he's alone in the ring. You can't see anybody else. You can't see any audience. It's him alone in the ring.
It's like a mid-range shot.
Psyching himself up. It almost looks like there's snow.
Yes.
Around. Like it almost looks like a winter scene. There's fog rising. Like this shot, I don't know how the hell I don't know how Scorsese did it. I'm sure some film major can tell me all about it, because I guarantee this shot has been studied nonstop since this film came out. It is gorgeous. There are other scenes. There are other amazing scenes in this, amazingly well shot scenes. But that one, as soon as I saw it, I was like, wow, that is pretty damn incredible.
Sure.
I see your opening scene and raise you his final bout with Sugar Ray.
Yep.
I was going to say it, but I wanted to leave it for you.
There you go.
Was like a master craft of cinema. The way they made the two actors look inhuman, but in a very subtle fashion.
Yeah.
But it's brutal. It's nasty. It's barbaric. And that was, I could see why this is rated so highly as a film based on sheer cinematography.
Exactly.
If not
story. Sure.
So,
sure.
Yeah.
I think you have to give it a 1 on style. I don't see how you can't.
There's not
do
much
that.
more to say. I mean, it's just amazingly shot throughout, and there are standout shots in this film that even today, this was filmed in 1980, or filmed before 1980, came out in 1980.
Released in 80, we'll say. Yes.
That I have not seen shots anywhere near that. And a lot of people have tried to rip it off, of course, but I have not seen shots like that in my life.
And
And
now you have.
That's a sign of a damn good film, So I'm going to give that a 1.
Okay, and on to recommendation with me. So, I'm going to pass this on to you, and then I'll give my recommendation last.
Well, again, I'm somewhat biased, I suppose. Yes, I would definitely recommend it. And even if it wasn't number 4 on the AFI list, I would still say it deserves to be seen, even if you don't get as much out of it as perhaps you would have, or I personally did earlier in my life. I still think it stands the test of time enough that it deserves to be seen. If you want to watch a classic film or see an earlier Scorsese film or anything like that, you should see this film, even if you don't like it, even if the hype doesn't live up to it necessarily. It still deserves to be seen, and that's all I can say.
This is not my fourth highest rated film of all time. I could certainly come up with four films that I enjoyed more than Raging Bull, but what I can say is that I think it's a movie that should be watched. A lot of times we talk about, you could watch this film and it would be better if you're looking for, this, if you're looking for this, you can watch this and it'll be better. If you're looking for this, you can watch this and it'll be better. I don't know what would be better than this in what it is.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, I think this is a film that kind of is on its own, in its own place, and I think it is very well done. It's well put together. It's I think that there are certainly better narrative movies out there, which is often what I enjoy about a movie. But that said, it is a movie that doesn't really have another movie like it that I've seen. And for that reason, I think that it's a movie that deserves to be watched. So I'm going to recommend it.
If you're a Robert De Niro or Joe Pesci fan, you probably should see this. If you're a film student, you're probably going to see this. If you're into cinematography, you're going to go see this. The average person, though, I don't know if there's so many more movies and certainly better, in a sense, Joe Pesci, Robert De Niro, and Martin Scorsese films that I would put before this work. And I like it a lot more having reviewed it than when I came out of watching this movie, but I would never, I didn't enjoy it enough to see it again, nor would I recommend it, and I don't think I would say that I particularly enjoyed it upon retrospect. So I'm going to give it a 0 recommendation.
All right.
So that is I'll give out the scores now. Scott gave it the highest with a 9, Steve-O with the 8, and me with the 7.
Descending. Yes.
Which sounds about right for how we usually...
It's like a box score.
So it's an 8 overall for Raging Bull. And I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Stephen Ramosi.
Get out of here.
And Scott Thurler.
And I think 8's about right, and I'll see you in the next fight.
We hope you've enjoyed your stay.
MOTSterpiece Theatre.
Join us again next time, won't you?
MOTSterpiece Theatre.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurler. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.
MOTSterpiece